We finished the previous year with the story, and I waited because I wanted you to hear this. It's quite fascinating. So you need some background a little bit, friends. We've come a long way. We've come a long way in terms of Chabad and the rest of the world. Chabad encountered tremendous opposition throughout its history. From the very beginning, from the Alter Rebbe, and particularly our Rebbe. Opposition, I mean, from the Haredi Torah world. Now, the opposition came from all quarters, not just the Lithuanian traditional Misnagdish, those who are opposed to the Chassidic movement, but also, as you know, more recently, and some of you weren't even born, but it wasn't that long ago, talking the late 70s, there was tremendous opposition coming from Satmar, which in many ways is representative of the Haredi world at its core. And I won't go into you will not believe if I even told you the degree of the opposition. And it was violent and extreme and public, and the story, it's not believable. Thank God it's not believable relative to where, thank God, we stand today. Just to give you a little illustration, the issues, the flashpoints were basically not just Hasidus, but primarily Chabad's fraternization with the secular world, Chabad being perceived and accused of being Zionists, and related such matters. And these were tremendous points of opposition, really at the core of the Jewish identity and the Jewish future. So to fast forward, I mean, I can't tell you, I won't go into it now, it's not the point. But to fast forward, a recent story, and last year, was it all in the news, there was a flight from New York to Tel Aviv on Friday, and it was delayed. It ended up landing in Athens without notice on Friday. And it's a flight from New York, so it's a mixture of Jews. We have all kinds, Williamsburg and Satmar and Chassidish and observant, not observant, and how the Chabad Shliach at short notice was able to host everybody and they had a Shabbos of their lives. It was written up in all of the newspapers. As a result of this, just last week, a mikveh that the Shliach there in Athens, in Greece, is seeking to build, spearheaded by Satmar. The funds were raised and the mikveh built. This story repeats itself all over the world, particularly in Asia with the Shluchim and Palm Springs, Nevada, where is it? Nevada, Palm Springs. Anyway, so Baruch Hashem, the world has changed, and the Shluchim in these distant places have contributed to the tearing down of the barriers between Jews. A Satmar Mashgiach, I keep on saying Satmar, but it's any kind of Hasidic Haredi, but that's the extreme, who is in Thailand because he's a Mashgiach for a company. Where's he going to go Shabbos? He's at the Shliach, and he hears Hasidus for the first time in his life and about the Neshama, and he sits with fellow Jews from all backgrounds and students and young men and women just out of the army without any Jewish background, and they're sitting at a table and he's connecting to the Neshama. And it's the last 10 years, it's happening, 15 years, a huge revolution. So the story I'm telling you now, friend, that's background. Now, that's the one you have to know. Number two, you have to know, this is unrelated, but you see it all comes together. When the Rebbe became Rebbe in 1951, it was a lot of work. The Rebbe wanted his message out. He had a message. He wanted it to be said. He wasn't just saying it Dvar Torah to make it a nice gathering. He had a message for the Jewish people and so on. But at the same time, the Chassidim had to work hard how to get the Rebbe to edit it and it should be published. These were things that did not happen easily. That's a subject for itself. But it doesn't happen easily. True leadership, there's a deep reluctance. It happens, but it's not like, listen to me and I've got to be heard. It's got to come from the people, and it's complex and nuanced. A subject for itself. But Malchus, what true leadership is, it's paradoxical throughout. The true leader is profoundly humble, the greatest introvert, and he's the greatest leader at the same time. The greatest extrovert at the same time. Simultaneously. If it's one or the other, is no leader. At any rate, so now that's another fact. Now, a second fact on the table to understand the story. A third thing. The story takes place in London in the early 50s. And that is right after the war. This is right after the war. Lubavitch is fledgling. And there was a brief moment then where there was Jewish unity. I got to tell you, right after the war, survivors, people didn't have the energy or the interest in ideological conflict. And there was a unity. People lived together in this town in Montreal. It all began in one location in the now it's called Mile End. That's where it all began. And then it fragmented different communities, uptown, downtown, Lubavitch. But in the early days in Melbourne as well, in London, all over the world, it was a handful of survivors. Everybody was together, united. They were blissful, beautiful years. Thank God it's come back. It's come back now in a much richer and deeper way. Respectful, unity, learning from each other. It's come full circle. It took 50, 70, 60 years, but it's come around again, Baruch Hashem. So this is in the early years, which will explain the story. Another thing you have to know, the early years, 1950, the world is in a sense, the Jewish world is, if you're still clinging onto faith after Auschwitz, after the Holocaust, it's very simple. It's not intellectual, and it's not. It's just I'm Jewish, and you continue it, and there was a lot of naivete compared to the so-called Jewish world today, which is very academic and so on. Coming out of the ashes, it wasn't academic. It's faith and simple neshama and pure, and that contributed to the harmony at the time. People went into ideological stuff, and okay, so that's the background to the story. So the story is this. So there's a famous chassid, a celebrated chassid of Ben Shem Tov. Just to give you an idea who this Ben Shem Tov was, first of all, context, Chaim Treitel, his wife, Basi Shem Tov, her grandfather. It's a grandfather. Just a snapshot of who the man was. The previous Rabbi in Russia during the terrible years, the 20s and 30s of persecution, when it was at its height of religion and Yiddishkeit, gathered 10 Chassidim, and made with them a Krishas Bris, a covenant to the last drop of blood, literally, to fight for the survival of Yiddishkeit underground. Arrest, torture, execution, to the last drop of blood. Most of them perished. There were a few that survived. He was one of them. And he did not change, even after he came out of Russia. And after the war, there was a window of opportunity. Chassidim were able to get out on false Polish passports. These were Polish Jews that had died. They got their passports and were able to get out through a lot of bribery. And my family came out, my mother, my grandparents. And Shem Tov, Ben Shez, he's called affectionately, he didn't change. The same total sacrifice, selflessness that defined him in Russia was in London. And then he lived in Israel, was killed in a car accident, tragically. So I give you an idea of who this person is. I mean, nothing stands in his way, not the Russian government, not communism, and not any opposition. So all of this now, friends, that I just told you, these various components, put it all together to give us context. So the story is told by a Jew, a big Rav. His name is Rabbi Rabbi. His name is Yaakov Mordechai Rappaport. He tells this following story. When he was a kid, he was 8, 9 years old. This is the early 50s in London. So it was a small community, and Ben Shem Tov said, we all live together. So he says, Ben Shem Tov says to me, Rabbi Shem Tov, come with me, we're going to do hafotza. We're going to spread Chassidus. That's the mandate of Chabad, is to spread Chassidus. So he goes to the Satmar Shul, Satmar Beis Medrash in London. This is 1950, early 50s. And I give you the background before who this Ben Shem Tov is. And he gives a patch on the table, and he starts to, he doesn't ask permission from the Gaboyim, and he starts to talk. He's saying Chassidus, he's talking about whatever, the Shambach, Gachapratis, he's giving Chassidic insight to the depth of Torah. People are like in shock. Yeah. After a few moments, again, this is the early days, it wasn't the antagonistic time. It was the very early days, so a few people go over to him and very politely say, Thank you very much, but that's not how it goes. And if you don't mind, they showed him politely the door. So this Rappaport was a kid. He says that this is what happened. The Rosh HaKol of Satmar then, which means the head of the community and a wealthy Jew, his name was Rabbi Getzel Berger. Rabbi Getzel turns, and he was obviously very friendly with Ben Shem Tov. He says to the people, Vatsi, this is not over yet. Sure enough, through a window in the shul, Ben Shem Tov opens the window and he continues talking where he left off, continuing to explain. So it's kind of humorous, funny. Here, listen to the story. So afterwards, he finishes. So this of Getzelberger approaches Ben Zion, says, listen to me, Hazachayin, the Ben Zion. He said, this is not a way. This is not a way you're going to bring the Rebbe's teachings, Chassidus, to anybody. I have a suggestion for you. And he takes and gives him 20 pounds. This is 20 pounds in those days was significant. He says to him, publish them, write them up, you'll publish them, and then you'll distribute them amongst everybody who wants to read will read. And you're not, that's an honorable way to bring the teachings. Anybody who wants can learn them. And so you'll make a fotza, you'll spread Chassidus. He says, you're right. This 20 pounds, I never knew the story, that comes from the head of the Satmar Kehillah in London, was the beginning of the whole Likutei Sichos, the whole organization that was dedicated to publishing and disseminating the Rebbe's talks. Can you imagine? It started with a suggestion and the money of a Satmar Chassid. Now I just want to read the end over here. This explains this, why this guy, who's not a Lubavitcher, who was a kid, he's telling this story on a plane back from New York, Gimel Tammuz, a few years ago, to the Chassidim who were wondering why, who are you and why were you going? So it's an amazing story and a beautiful story of how and full circle. And it's very significant because at the end of the day, if you want to get any message across, friends, you cannot force it. It's got to come from the people. It's got to come from, you've got to make them want it. It's got to come from them. It's in everything, your child, in work, your student. And here, it's such a symbolic story that from a part of Judaism that was oppositional, that's what really began, and it's come full circle again. Hope you appreciate the beautiful story. Okay.
Fantastic. Beautiful.